You are listening to the
World Extreme.
World Extreme Medicine.
The World Extreme Medicine
Podcast.
In this episode, we're going to be speaking with Mike Keane on exploring ancestral diets. So what to do is really do a deep dive into an epic trip and challenge that Mike undertook last year, kayaking the entire 3,000-kilometer length of Greenland's rugged coastline. So he did this while surviving solely from an ancestral Inuit diet of seal, whale, dried fish, and wild foraged plants. So for 2 months, Mike braved the icy waters, relentless storms, and strict high-fat, low-carb diets that radically transformed his body and mind. So working with researchers at King's College London, his journey offered a fascinating insight into the traditional diets and how they can dramatically improve health and performance under extreme conditions. So join us in this conversation as we explore Mike's transformative journey and indeed the science behind ancestral diets and the lessons that we can all learn about reconnecting with our environment and eating as nature intended. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I wonder if we could just kick off and get you to really speak to what inspired you to embark on such an extreme challenge by kayaking the length of Greenland while surviving solely from a traditional Inuit diet.
Yeah, so I'm a chef by trade, and I've been, for the last 10 or 15 years, been looking into evolutionary diets and nutrition and how we've evolved with food over 2 or 3 million years plus, because it's become more and more apparent that our modern kind of the global food system now is failing us big time with the amounts of obesity, heart disease, inflammatory diseases, all that kind of stuff is killing us, and it's skyrocketing at the moment, and it's pretty much down to our food and ultra processed garbage basically that's going in our bodies. And I had a contract actually just before COVID to write a book on fermentation, and they paid for me to go out to Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. And then COVID hit, and they dropped half their authors. But by that time, they'd already given me the money, and I'd spent it. So they weren't getting that back. So I was in Greenland, and just traveling all the way up the west coast from south to north. And it pretty much turns out the more extreme the environment and the more harsh the weather and conditions, the more harsh and kind of unforgiving are the ferments and the type of food that they've traditionally, survived on in those kind of regions. When you come to Greenland, pretty much when you look out, it's just ice, water, and rock, and that's it. It's very, very much apparent there's no kind of agriculture here or orchards or some kind of fertile land that you can just go and pick apples off the tree. It's you look out and you think, how on earth did anyone ever survive here? And the Inuit have been coming down from Alaska and Siberia through Greenland for the last 6,000 or 7,000 years. And they weren't blessed with the luxuries that we have of like Gore-Tex and sat phones and that really rugged plastic fossil fuel based kayaks. They're made theirs out of driftwood and sealskin and whatever they can catch basically. So when you're out here, it really strikes home how bloody tough they were, over thousands of years. And so I was having a couple of beers with a chef, a fellow chef of mine, and we were talking about the Greenlandic language. It's very kind of guttural cues, and it's like, and it's totally alien to any kind of European-based language. And the town that's furthest in the south is called Kakotok, and the town right up in the north is called Karnak. And kayak, the word kayak comes from Greenlandic kayak, spelt with 2 Q's. So I was just mucking about and thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you could kayak from Kakotok to Karnak and all these Q's? And then pretty much a couple of beers later, and I talked myself into it, and I couldn't really back out of it. So that was that. But a quick Google showed me it was like 3,300 kilometer. I was thinking, oh, if I can do 33K a day, that's 100 days. That's probably quite doable. And so I planned it for the next year. And I haven't got a background in special forces or military at all, or even kayaking. I've been kayaking for 2 years before that. So it was very much just a kind of spur of the moment thing. And yeah, being a chef and talking as I did at the time about ancestral diets, it was a subject that's pretty close to my heart about how the Inuit survived out here. So I was thinking, oh, perhaps I should add that into the mix as well, and see if I can complete it on a purely ancestral Inuit diet. So, like you said, sea mammals, fish, and the occasional reindeer or muskox. And so that's what I did. I managed to recruit the services of a whole bunch of microbiologists and nutritionists, and got Professor Tim Spector from Twins UK and Zoe and King's College to kind of be the main analyst on it. And yeah, had a whole comprehensive set of tests at St Thomas Hospital in London before I went, and the day I came back as well, with pretty amazing results actually. Yeah, it was amazing results. It was totally unexpected.
So could you speak to just exactly what you did find? Because, like you said, fundamentally, your body is adapting to a diet which is almost entirely composed of animal fat and protein. Could you speak to how your body responded during the trip, and maybe even what you found retrospectively when you got back?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of had a 10-day acclimatization period before I started kayaking, because after I'd done some research, the first time you kind of effectively go onto a keto diet from a traditional Western diet, you're going to experience some diarrhea. And yeah, when you're stuck in a dry suit 10 kilometers away from any land, it's not the best situation to be in. So it took me about 7 or 8 days and to acclimatize to that diet. And it didn't make me feel rough at all. It was just, very obvious that it was quite explosive. And yeah, 7 or 8 days afterwards, and it kind of leveled out, and I was fine. And then, so I took off from Kokoltok at the end of April, and the first time I hit a pair of scales again was actually in Nuuk, exactly 4 weeks later. And I was kind of gobsmacked that I'd lost. I worked out that I'd lost just over 2 stones, 14 kilo in weight, and I've never been kind of an overweight guy, but I've never been toned and slim. And it kind of shook me a little bit, because I hadn't realized, because you're very rarely naked in front of a mirror when you're in the middle of Greenland. So I hadn't realized quite that 2 stones that's a lot of weight to lose. So I was thinking, oh man, I've just been tapping into my energy reserves, and at some point that's gonna, there's a finite reserve there. At some point I'm going to crash, keel over, and drown. That was my main worry. But I didn't have a med team on the ground with me there, so I kind of just it'll be fine. So I didn't change anything, and I'd gone from, like, my kind of English weight is 90 kilo. I went down to 75, and it stayed at 75 for the remaining 3 months without me changing anything at all. So there was no, I didn't start bulking up on carbs or anything like that at all. I didn't change anything. And actually for the whole, it was just over 105 days altogether. And I didn't touch a single piece of fruit or a single piece of veg the whole way. It was just meat, fish. And it was the whole range. It wasn't just cooked meat, but there was quite a lot of raw meat and raw fat, and also fermented meat and fat as well. And the fat element was about 35-40% of the overall diet. And I'd never felt better. I've always worked out. I've always kept fairly active. And I couldn't believe the energy levels. But my goal was to hit kind of 35K a day. And then my best day was 85 kilometers, and I was regularly doing over 60 kilometers, which, I'm 55 now, so no spring chicken. And it was quite astounding to me that I could just keep going for 12, 15 hours of kayaking, and the only thing that kind of made me stop was when I had to go stop for a toilet break, pretty much. So that was pretty phenomenal, actually. And the tests that I got back were so comprehensive. I'm not a trained nutritionist or obviously a doctor, so I was thinking, oh, okay, it'd be great to get some results back. But then when you get them, you're presented with all this, like, kind of high tech, very much in depth analysis of your bloods and stool, and also genetics we did as well, just to see what kind of conditions and what types of nutrition I was predisposed towards. And yeah, and Tim Spector himself said I went out like a normal bloke and came back in an athlete's body. It was the change was that dramatic. So yeah, there wasn't a downside as far as my well-being, mental well-being, or physiology. There wasn't a downside. At no point did I, was I feeling full or hungry or fatigued or anything, which was, it couldn't have been planned better, really, because I was really loath before I went out to have army ration packs or dehydrated, the usual kind of expedition fare. I really didn't want to do that. And so I guess the results were really vindicated. That decision to just live off the environment, which after all is, that's pretty much what I speak about, the whole time when I'm giving talks like I am in Greenland this week. I talk about how we've evolved in our environment over millions of years. It's as a species we adapt super slowly and to conditions in our environment. So I think to be able to immerse yourself not only in the landscape like I was doing when I was kayaking, but to follow how humans have evolved here over thousands of years by eating that environment, which is super local. Kind of, I don't think I could have been more in balance with the landscape and the environment than I was then, which, if you think about it, it's very rare nowadays to be able to be in that position that you can do that, where there's so many outside influences, man-made products and materials. It's a rare thing to do, and I feel very privileged that I managed to do that.
Could you speak to the environment, Mike, if that's possible? Just you're in Arctic conditions, and those can be quite volatile and dynamic at a number of points along the way. Could you speak to the conditions and indeed maybe how available or non-available the food sources were, how difficult it was to find food every day?
Yeah, sure. It was bloody horrible, the environment. So I left in spring, what should have been spring, but anyone in Greenland or the Arctic over the last few years will have told you how different the seasons are all kind of gone screwy, that it's not predictable like it was 5-10 years ago. And in spring when I left, when it's the sun should have been a lot stronger or at least visible occasionally, but it was still like winter. That it was all the seasons were still one season behind. So it got down to -12 when I was out here, and then for the first I barely saw the sun for the first 40 days, and then pulling. Yeah, every time I wanted to stop with the kayak, I had to pull it over the ice shelf at the high tide mark, which is unusual for the last it's totally unusual. It shouldn't have been that difficult, and there was quite a few days where I couldn't leave the camp because of the weather, the storms, and I'm not the most confident kayaker, so I and also being by yourself, you've got no backup. So, and I think there's 2 Coast Guard boats covering the whole 3,500 kilometers on the west coast. So if you're in trouble, you're really going to be in trouble out here. So there was, I probably had, out of 105 days, probably had 10 or 12 down days where I just couldn't move because of the weather. And one storm in particular, I was just like stuck in a tent for 3 days and 3 nights, and I was deaf at the end of it because it was just blowing. It was like I'd been to a gig. The tent was constantly shaking, and the wind actually picked the kayak up and smashed it through the tent and gashed me under the eye as well at one point. And I found the kayak that 10 meters up the hill, half sticking out of a frozen tarn. It was wild weather, really crazy. But obviously one of the things that is great about modern technology, you've got the GPS and you've got fantastic weather forecasting as well, which I think if I hadn't have had that, there was a couple of moments where I probably would have been a goner, I think, without having that kind of that high-tech forecast there to give me some assistance.
So looking at the availability of food, Mike, was it quite challenging to find food every day, or how did that play out over time?
Yeah, well, because I'm by myself, and I had a rifle the whole time because of polar bears as a deterrent. And yeah, so I guess I had a rifle. So if I'd been in trouble, I could have shot a seal if I needed to. But a seal's like minimum 20 kilos. So for me to shoot one would have been a waste because I couldn't carry much of it with me, and I definitely couldn't eat a 20-kilo seal in one go. But what is fantastic about Greenland, they're for a country of 57,000 people, they're super well connected. You know, the 7 o'clock news every night, loads of people watch it. It's like back in the UK 15, 20 years ago when everyone used to watch the news. It's like that. And their take up on social media is brilliant. Their Facebook, I think they're the third highest proportion of Facebook users, per capita in the world. And it really shows. And the national TV had picked up on me before the night before I left, and they'd featured it, and I had a live map on my website with a tracker, so anyone going on my website could see where I was, which is better than I could do really. So it's numerous times where I came around small islands, and I could see the next settlement in front of me, and half the time they'd closed the school, and there was kids there with the Greenlandic flags, and they knew I was eating Greenlandic food, which they really got behind. And so every single time that I stopped in a settlement, which was probably about 30% of the time, I was wild camping 70%, and the remainder was staying in a settlement. There was at least 2 or 3 people there with a big bag full of seal meat or walrus or whale or anything like that, and the offer of a bed for the night, which was I'm not much for crying, but I was probably weeping a good 5 or 6 times along the whole course, because it's so emotional when you haven't seen another human for 7 or 10 days, and you come round the corner and there's like half the tiny settlements there greeting you, and they've got food and a warm bed for you. It's just an incredible experience. So yeah, most of the time I was actually given the food from locals and settlements. And if I knew I had a stretch of 7 or 10 days coming up, then I would cook up a big seal or raw stew or a fish stew, and then bag it just so that I could eke it out and warm it up each night. And that was another kind of surprising thing that I hadn't really appreciated before. In my mind, I had me kind of, pulling the kayak up, setting the tent up, and the sun comes out, and I cook the little Instagram worthy little meal or something like that. But it was so cold. As soon as you stop, you get naked, and you get your dry clothes on, and then you can worry about the tent and the sleeping bag and pulling the kayak up. And it really drove home how functional food is in those situations. Out the window is any kind of semblance of making it taste nice or being anywhere near fancy with it, and which is kind of mirrored in the Greenlandic food here anyway. Is the high proportion of dried food, and the food that they do have, and they cook hot, is always, 20 minutes maximum. There's no history of slow cooking or cooking it till it falls off the bone or anything lovely like that. And you can see why, because there's no fuel here, there's no trees that grow here, and there's very limited driftwood. So trying to start a fire is really difficult. Um, and historically, over thousands of years, the energy would have been way too important just to fritter away on spending 2 or 3 hours cooking a seal stew. So it was, I'd never really made that connection before. And I think us in the West, we're so kind of babied in effect by the huge amount of food that we have in supermarkets, and we can go out anywhere or can order a takeout. We don't really make that connection between the food and survival. It just doesn't exist for us anymore. Whereas out here, as soon as you step out of a settlement, it's very visceral. It's right there in your face, going, right, if there's a storm coming and you haven't got enough food, you're going to die. Yeah, you're going to be in real trouble. So it was that was a really interesting aspect of the trip that I hadn't appreciated. And I don't think if anyone had told me before, I would have gone, yeah, I don't. Yeah, well, load of rubbish. But it's not until you're actually in there, in the middle of it, and you can't cook because the weather's, blowing a hoolie or whatever, that you start to appreciate it.
So you mentioned about dropping weight, dropping approximately 2 stone in weight,
Yeah.
almost 20 kilograms. Did that affect your energy levels or your strength or indeed your overall health at all? Because like you say, you're kayaking every day, probably at what to say an average, did you say of 30 Ks a day?
Well, between
20,
30 and 80. So it's a
gosh.
big, yeah, it's a big window there. Yeah.
Yeah. And how were your energy levels in that time?
It was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, it was weird because I don't recall, and I'm pretty sure at the time because I kept quite a comprehensive journal. At no point was I fatigued, which yeah, really surprised me. And yeah, it's 24-hour sunlight as well, so it's not like I've got day and night, and I can kind of okay, it's getting dark. I'm going to have a sleep now. So yeah, I just kept going during the day, and sometimes depending on islands and the availability of landing safely, sometimes just just I'll give it another 20K, another 4 or 5 hours of kayaking, which was yeah, really surprising to me that I'd had that amount of energy. And also, which is the thing on the keto diet, which effectively I was on, is like your satiety is you don't need to eat much before you feel full. Yeah, I was very rarely hungry, and I very rarely ate anything hot except for my kind of evening meal or the meal when I finished my main part of kayaking for the day. So for breakfast, I just had a couple of bits of dried whale or dried fish, and then I used to just snack on whale or seal jerky as I was kayaking, and I used to save up a seal stew or a whale stew for the evening as my main treat for when I've unpacked and I got the tent set up. Um, but in terms of the volume of food that I was eating was tiny amounts, which again kind of contributed a little bit to my worry after that initial 4 weeks when I'd lost that much weight. And I was thinking, oh, yeah, perhaps I need to eat more. But then, I had enough food. At no point did I go hungry, and I just I didn't feel the need to eat anymore. And it turns out that it wasn't necessary anyway. I was touch wood. I was fine for the whole time. But what was really interesting was after that initial, because I had to split it into like two sections in the end. I was intending to do the whole 3,500, but when I got to Upernavik, which is in the north, about 2,500 K from when I started, the weather had been it was so weird and at odds with the normal patterns that the whole of Melville Bay was impassable. Really, it was just solid ice. So you'd have had to go out, almost towards Canada to get around this ice. So that last 900K stretch, I left until end of last year. But in the meantime, I had the chance to go back to East Greenland after, in February, March, and April last year to do exactly the same diet, but without any kayaking. So I thought this would be a great comparison to see exactly what effect the kayaking had. And I had the same medical test before and after, and I lost exactly the same amount of weight. In the meantime, I'd gone back up to my normal English weight of 90 kilo, but I lost the same weight. I lost 2 stone again, despite not doing any kayaking, which was, yeah, which was probably the biggest single result that kind of blew me away. And since then, I've spoken to Tim Spector and Dr. Andrew Jenkinson, who's got a couple of books out, and it turns out that the weight loss is 95% of any weight loss will be down to your diet. It's only when you're doing kind of Olympic level amounts of training, physical training, that starts to have an impact on the weight loss. There's loads of other benefits, for physiology and your muscle to fat ratio and your general health. But in terms of weight loss, the exercise had minimal impact, which you think kayaking 3,500K would be a significant part of that weight loss, but it turns out it wasn't, which was another kind of jaw dropper for me.
Yeah, indeed. It's fascinating, really, from multiple angles, really,
Yeah.
Mike. Could you maybe speak to some of the challenges you faced relying entirely on an Inuit diet compared to maybe a modern Western diet? I can think of one, just a repetition of the same food every day. But
Yeah.
could I get you to speak to any other challenges? Did it bung you up? There was any constipation? Was there any other issues that you didn't maybe initially anticipate?
No, it was the Yeah, because I was taking stool samples like 3 times a week, and yeah, ticking off my the stool on the Bristol stool chart, which I'm sure you're aware of, that 1 to 7 from super hard to super soft, which for a Brit is absolutely hilarious. And it kept me going a lot of the times when it's miserable and snowing outside, and you've got your shorts down on a big chunk of ice, and you're going, oh, what was I thinking here? But in terms of regularity, when I'm on a kind of a normal carb kind of English Western diet, I normally have a bowel movement, or a poo, as a lot of people call it, 2 or 3 times a day. But back on the Greenlandic diet, once a day, regular as clockwork, and there were poster boy poos. They were beautiful, sleek and glossy. Number 4 or 5 on the Bristol stool chart. It was a couple of times you look and you go, oh yeah, that's a pretty good one. So in terms of that, I was I had one or 2 days of constipation. But I don't know why that would have been. I think that was at the end of a particularly long 7 or 8 day stretch in between settlements, and I'd had walrus stew every night, which, you're right, just drives you nuts. It did 3 or 4 nights, and you got a bag of walrus stew, and you go, oh, what was I thinking? Why didn't I just mix it up and get some fish in there as well? But in terms of variety, there was a surprisingly there was a lot of different things that I ate. As I came, pretty much as I left the south, it was the start of the lumpfish caviar season, which is quite a really short season, but it's really well kind of regulated, and it just so happens that it goes in sections up the west coast of Greenland. So any kind of hunters that I met weren't hunting, or they weren't shooting seal or anything like that. They were just getting lumpfish, which is a really ugly looking fish, and they just take the roe out. But a couple of times I was given a bag for 2 kilo worth of caviar in it, and I was just eating raw caviar or cooking it with seagull eggs. And seagull eggs were a really good source of protein and food on the way up as well. And it's quite easy to see there's thousands of tiny islands and islets and whatever as you go up. And if you can see the seagulls on there, and it's somewhere good to land. So I used to pop out, pick up a couple of eggs, and that was a scrambled egg dinner for me that evening, which was brilliant. And then different types of fish. You got halibut, cod, lumpfish, redfish. So that's pretty good. And depending on where you're stopping, people have always got reindeer or muskox in the freezers as well. So you do get a good variety. It wasn't too boring, but when I was cooking for myself and I just cooked a big stew, and 3 days into a 7 or 8 day stretch, you're going, oh, I'm getting really bored with this seal stew now. But it was pretty interesting. And as you get north, you get to these amazing ferments like the kiviak, which you've probably heard of, which is that they catch these little orc seabirds, which are millions, perhaps billions of them up in the north. Really funny looking, like puffin type birds. But they stuff between 300 and 500 of them inside a seal, sew the seal up, push the air out, and then they bury it for 6 months. And then they take the birds out. You just push the feathers off, and it's raw, but it's been fermented, so it tastes like the strongest blue cheese you've ever had. And you can just push the meat off the bone with your fingers because it's like a pate. And if you close your eyes, you'd swear you're eating a gorgonzola or a strong Stilton, but because it's got a beak and wings and stuff, it's perhaps it shouldn't taste like that. But I ate quite a lot of that, and you can almost feel. You almost get a little high off these strongly fermented meats. It's quite a weird experience, really, but incredible because there's no salt. There's no trees, so they haven't got a culture of evaporating seawater to create salt to preserve stuff like they have in the Mediterranean. It's just effectively a raw bird inside a raw seal, and the ambient temperature is like 8 degrees, so it's not even been frozen for 6 months. And just that ingenuity in the face of extreme adversity is amazing, really, really amazing. And there's 2 or 3 dishes like that out here which would blow you away. Whether or not you'd want to have it as your Christmas dinner, I don't know, but it just shows how resilient humans have been over the course of their evolution in these really hostile landscapes and environments.
Mike, could I get you to speak to, you've already spoken to climate change and indeed the ice pack, and indeed the in a way the anatomy of the ice is fundamentally changed and wasn't anticipated as you were progressing on the trip. Could I get you to speak to any other of the sort of unpredictable seasonal weather attributes that you found on the trip?
Yeah, the biggest one was the temperature. Yeah, there are some stretches of coastline that are really kind of bleak, and they just stretch forever. It's if you've been kayaking, you just like kind of jump from headland to headland, and sometimes it just doesn't feel like they're getting closer at all. And you've been kayaking for hours and hours, and when the wind's driving and it's snowy and blizzarding, it's just a miserable experience. So that was, yeah, the temperatures was by far the worst one. And a couple of times in the fjord systems, actually just outside Nuuk, was probably the biggest one. And you get caught, like this would have been in May, end of May time. And the fjords to start freezing up. I guess they're not pure seawater. They've got a mix of fresh water, so they're going to freeze a bit easier than the sea does. But a couple of times I got up in the morning, and the whole fjord had frozen. So I had to, got my spare paddle. I had to duct tape my the ice axe to the end of my spare paddle, and then just chip away at the front of the kayak, and then kayak a little bit forward, and then do it again. And just trying to go a kilometer took well over an hour, and you're sweaty, and it's, oh my God, I've got to get out of this. Otherwise, if this goes on for another 10K, I don't know what I'm going to do. So yeah, that happened 2 or 3 times when it was a bit of a worry that I was going to get caught in the frozen ice, which shouldn't have happened at all at that time of year. So that was probably the biggest worry. And then pulling the kayak over an ice shelf pretty much for the whole of the first 40 days is really restricts the amount of landing opportunities you've got, because sometimes it's like 2 or 3 meter. The tide difference is 2 or 3 meters, so you've got a big ice shelf that's crumbling because the weather was supposedly warming up. That's crumbling, so you really don't want a couple of tons of ice to fall on the kayak. So that was another kind of an issue that I hadn't really thought about. And to be honest, I've done most of my research by looking on YouTube, because I haven't got a big history of kayaking, and all my kayaking that I'd done had been in Greenland before, when I'd been working in the south, and it wasn't with groups at all. It was always by myself. So the actual learning curve of kayaking around icebergs was pretty steep as well, which icebergs are terrifying, absolutely terrifying, because if they carve, then their center of gravity moves, and the whole iceberg of 200,000 tons can flip over so quickly. And a couple of times, not necessarily on this expedition, but when I was teaching myself how to kayak in Greenland, a couple of times you hear this ear-splitting crack when you're getting close to an iceberg. I say close, 100 meters, and then you can hear something big's happening, and you in your minds you've just got this thought of a huge tsunami that's full of ice right behind you. And a couple of times I must have done a comedy kayak escape where it felt like the kayak was out the water, and I was just going hell for leather trying to get away. And then you turn around and there's nothing there, and you can't even see which iceberg it was that had cracked or calved. So kayaking around icebergs, I've got a hell of a lot of respect for icebergs.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like you said, it's a dynamic environment anyway, but that just adds an extra level of challenge, really.
Yeah.
Mike, could I get you to speak to, I guess in a way, what was the most physically and or emotionally challenging moments during your kayak expedition? And sort of how did you navigate that? You've spoken already to the isolation, although you did engage with communities along the way, so you might have been seeing people along the way. But can I
Yeah.
get you to speak to either the biggest psychological and/or physical challenge that you faced on the trip?
Yeah, I think, but I don't think it's just kind of just me, but I think it's most people when you're, when you're out on the water and you're kayaking, you can be in some pretty bad stormy conditions, and you're so immersed in the moment that you're not too worried about it, even though you're slightly mildly terrified that you're going to go over, which I never did, the capsize. But it's when the weather's been really bad, or you're about to launch and you're looking at the waves and you're thinking, Christ, I don't think I can do that. That looks too dangerous. Or, you always doubt yourself when you're outside looking in to what it is you're doing. And there were several times that I was in that position when I'd been I'd had to stay in the tent for a day or two because the wind was too bad. And then you're standing there, or you're sitting there in the tent and you're looking out at the waves, and there's and there's ice everywhere and it's miserable, and you're thinking, oh my God, I don't think I can get back in there. I'm not good enough for this. So I think the self-confidence takes a real battering when you're when you're slightly removed, just perhaps in a tent looking down on it. But there was definitely a few times when I'd had a particularly rough landing. And you pull the kayak up and you look out and you think, I can't possibly do this. Those waves are crazy. And then you think, actually, I've just been kayaking through those waves for the last 10 hours. Perhaps it's not as bad as all that. But I think your self-confidence, especially when you're by yourself, I think your self-confidence is quite easy to knock yourself and to think you're not up to the challenge, or you're not able to do that. But I think that's possibly some kind of self-preservation mechanism there to stop you, getting too much bravado and taking a risk, I think. So there's always that, and even now, all the times that I've been back to Greenland and I haven't kayaked, and you look at the water and you just wonder how the hell you kayaked 3,000 kilometers through that, because I really wouldn't fancy it now. But then when you put yourself in that position, it's a different kettle of fish. I think that was the biggest learning curve for me. I think was to trust my own kind of skills and still have a healthy respect for how much nature can teach you, but don't take the mickey, and definitely don't push it too much. I think that was probably the biggest thing, apart from the storms when the kayak got smashed the tent, and after 3 days, and then I went suddenly from being I was in this a horrible position, but I was in a dry tent, and I was in a sleeping bag, and I had enough food, so I wasn't going anywhere. But suddenly the tent pole had been smashed in half, and I'd got a cut under my eye, and the tent had just dropped on me and everything was wet. So I had to climb into my dry suit and then just try not to get too hypothermic. So it was that was probably the biggest moment where I realized that how thin that line is between being safe and being completely in the cack, and how quickly that can turn. And it does it gives you a lot more appreciation, I think, for it, because there was several moments when you think, if I capsize now, I'm going to be in real trouble, because even though you're in a dry suit, you're going to get wet, or you got to try and climb back in the boat and do a self-rescue. It just brings that to the fore a lot more when you've been exposed to that kind of I guess danger, but that's something that humans have evolved with for millions of years. It's only in the last few generations where we've had all this extra backup with emergency services and all that kind of tech and comms and stuff that we have nowadays.
Yeah,
So
no,
there's quite
indeed.
a few situations like that.
Yeah, challenging. And like you said before, two rescue boats, so two lifeboats for the whole entire coastline. So to your point, if anything does happen in an acute sense, nothing is happening from a rescue sense anytime quickly,
Yeah,
certainly quickly
yeah.
enough to get you out of
Yeah, you get
danger.
a personal beacon, but that goes to a Garmin call center or something in Europe, and then that gets farmed back out to Greenland. But the chance of anyone picking up on that from Greenland is very remote. And they've got helicopters. If the weather's okay, they can send a helicopter out. But even then, it's like, I think it was like $60,000 or something, yeah, minimum to pay for the helicopter. So yeah, which was beyond my insurance bracket.
Yeah, no, indeed, indeed, indeed. Just as we're coming into land, a couple more questions. One would be, Mike, around, as a chef, how has this experienced kind of fundamentally reshaped your perspective on modern food systems, Mike, and indeed the way we approach nutrition?
Yeah, I'd say it's totally changed my whole perspective on food, actually. Mainly because I think when you're immersed in the environment, you become, especially when you're by yourself 24/7 for such a long time, you really start reflecting on how humans have evolved, not just in difficult environments like the Arctic, but all around the world. And it really does kind of make it sink in that for millions and millions of years as we've evolved, we've only ever eaten what's within 10 kilometers or so of where we live. And it's been totally seasonal. And it's been, we haven't had stuff flown from, the other side of the world. It hasn't ever been sprayed with, fertilizers or injected with antibiotics or anything like that. And you start to realize how processed all of our food is. We're obviously from England, so you realize how many steps removed most of the food that we eat is from its original source. And yeah, over the last 2 or 3 years, I've done a lot of reading and research into it. And you know, the instances of, like I said, obesity, heart disease, um, and all those terrible kind of modern diseases are pretty much mostly preventable by having a good diet. And at no point in our evolution have we been processing grains or genetically selecting grains or fruit to be better or more productive or have higher yields. And we've never fed our animals full of soy or corn or anything that they shouldn't be eating like we're doing now. And it really is the reason why our health as a species has gone down the swanny. It is because we've based everything on this hyper capitalism now, where money and shareholder returns trumps everything. Money is the be all and end all, whereas it never was that at all for 99.999% of our evolution. It's been health, community, what's out there, sustainability, whether it was intended or not. That's just how we've been. So now my diet is very simple. I don't eat any carbs as such. I don't have any rice, pasta. I make my own sourdough, which I have occasionally, but that most of it goes to the family. So it's I've really kind of dumbed down. And my general kind of mantra for food is don't dick about with food. The more steps removed it is from its original form, the worse it is for you. And that goes for, you look on the labels of most things in the supermarkets, and half of them you wouldn't find in a chemistry lab, because it's just like, what the hell is that? And full of sugar, processed stuff, and that totally interferes with our signaling within our body, our hormones, and everything. And it totally makes sense if you look at it in a kind of evolutionary sense. It makes complete sense that the more removed it is from its original form, the more difficult it's going to be for our bodies to process it. Which, if you're on an expedition, pretty much anywhere in the world where you go on an expedition, humans have been there already. Save for, let's say, the Antarctic, where it's going to be difficult to get much food. But anywhere else, if you're going into the Amazon or Arabia or Middle East or wherever, people have been living indigenously and off the land for hundreds of thousands of years. So they are way more adapted than us, bringing our kind of ration packs and stuff you just pour hot water on. So I think there's a real lesson to be learned from the humans that have gone before. To me, it just makes sense that you're becoming a lot more in balance with your environment wherever it is by eating the food that's in that environment. That's how we've survived there optimally for hundreds of thousands of years. So I think that's a really important aspect of how we should be looking at traveling in these remote areas.
And finally, Mike, could I just get you to speak to what's next, really? What are some of the possibilities, and or how has this trip sparked your sense of curiosity for other environments?
Yeah, so it's the reason I'm kind of using the Greenland thing as a springboard is that there's such few areas of these indigenous pockets around the world left where they've got a real good and strong connection to the environment. My plan is to go and visit as many of these as I can. So I was going to the Amazon, Ecuador, for February and March, but insurance and money and commercialism has kind of taken over that. I did have a film crew coming out with me, but the insurance has gone absolutely crazy for kidnappings and that kind of thing. So, which is really disappointing. But I've got a potential couple of other ones, Rwanda or Ethiopia would be amazing. But what I want to do is not just go on all these expeditions, for the sake of it, but to use it to generate discourse on how our global food system can and should change. So at the moment, the narrative is to push for maize, corn, soy, rice, all these carbs basically, and that's what the whole world's been kind of converted to. But that's not how we've evolved as a species at all. To me, it's going down the wrong road, and promoting all these monocultures, monocrops, where they're all being fertilized, the animals are all injected with hormones and antibiotics, is just totally the wrong way to go. So we need to look back at our evolution and how we've evolved. And in terms of like the Western society, it's really difficult now because there's virtually no one left alive who lives off the land. It's all supermarkets and this crazy culture that we have where seasons don't matter, availability doesn't matter, because we can get pretty much what we want where we want from the supermarket down the road. So what I'm trying to do is use lessons that I'm learning in these indigenous places to perhaps improve our diet in these highly civilized in brackets areas of the world like England, where most people would be hard pushed to tell you what kind of indigenous foods we should be eating, and that was best suited to our environment. So yeah, that's what I'm using it for. And if I can continue going to these indigenous places before they're lost forever, and try and document some of it, then that would be a great life's work, I think.
No, indeed, it would. Absolutely. And Mike, we're going to keep close tabs on you actually, because it would be lovely to revisit this when you are undertaking another expedition, and just really get insights, because I think it's fascinating. And like you said, returning to some of the fundamental food groups that we were born and bred on, back as nature intended it, and just, but like you said, learning the lessons from different ecosystems as well, and seeing how different tribes and or populations engage with food, fundamental food sources. So we'll keep close tabs on that, because I think it'd be fascinating. And what we'll do as well is put in the show notes links to resources that you have found. Indeed, you're out in Greenland. I'm speaking to you in Greenland at the moment, and just links that you would advocate that people can do their own research on some of these food sourcing that you speak on, and that you are indeed speaking on at the moment. Because I think it's fascinating for people to go away and do some more research on topics like this. And also, if people want to reach out to you, how would they go about reaching out to you, Mike?
Social medias, it's all at Eat Your Environment. So across Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, even my website is eatyourenvironment.com. But yeah, at Eat Your Environment, and you'll find me on there.
Fantastic. Listen, thanks for the last hour, Mike, and we'll revisit this down the line. Thank you again.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.